Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Society. It's wonderful to have you here. Before we begin today's program, allow me to acknowledge our global trustees in the audience today. Lulu Wang, our Vice Chair, Frank Brown, Nick Royton, Ashit Mita, and Gary Shao, and Susan Lynch. Thank you for your leadership and support. Without you, we couldn't go this far. Thank you. And to all the ambassadors and consul generals from New York Diplomatic Corps and our friends and colleagues from the journalist community, thank you for joining us and listening to us over the years. Really appreciate that. And for those we haven't met before, my name is Chen Jing. I run the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society, which I co-founded with Kevin Rudd about 3 years ago. And I'm proud to say that we have grown over the past 3 years from about 5 people in New York to over 70 across 10 different countries. And I'm also proud to say there's no bubble in either real estate or in artificial intelligence. We have grown in real intelligence. And I have some evidence for that. By early December 2025, CCA has been quoted by over 700 times by real, not fake media. We have published about 109 op-eds in Foreign Affairs, South China Morning Post, New York Times, Financial Times, all very good medias. And we often brief policymakers in capitals of Asia, Europe, and surely in Beijing and DC. And our private newsletters, the Inside Beijing Beltway, has been widely read by decision makers in business and policy circles. But another piece of good news I want to share with you is about myself. Earlier this year, I somehow became the youngest vice president of this 70-year-old institution. Somehow, I think that suggests American dream is still alive, somehow, at least in a very small sample size level in me. But I think the real hope of the American dream in my family is with my son, Hassan, who was born just about a year ago, somewhere near here. So she's an American citizen with a proper birth certificate, which means he will be eligible to run for the President of the United States in the year 2060, right? So that's Hassan who's trying to persuade our cat Marshmallow to vote for him. Maybe in the era of AI, cats can vote. So if he really wants to try, either for the president or the mayor of New York by the year of 2060, this is a campaign slogan, as you can see: vote for Hudson in 2060, vote for a promising future of truth and prosperity. It rhymes. But let me explain how it works and how it's related to our conference today. Hudson's Chinese name is Qian Chen, which means a promising future. But let me put them aside. Qian is my family name, means money. And if you attended Lulu's very good conversation with Hillary Clinton, Lulu reminded us money is something unifies everybody. In US, in China, elsewhere, people want money. But we have to make that into a campaign slogan, hence prosperity, common prosperity in a Chinese sense. And Chen in Chinese means truthfulness. So if I'm being earnest, if Hudson, someone like Hudson, can one day become a major political leader in the United States, wouldn't that be a powerful signal that a peaceful US-China coexistence is truly possible? So when Hassan arrived, it gives me a feeling he could be a bridge between cultures, a bridge between identities, A bridge nowadays increasingly felt like caught in between. So that feeling, caught in between, I think is somehow felt by a lot of people in this room. Many of us are increasingly living in that middle space, becoming increasingly narrower between US and China. You would understand the pressure, you would understand the complexity, but you would also understand why that space matters more and more. Because that space is where possibilities live. That space is where solutions live. And that space is where humanity really live. And the Center for China Analysis is beginning with that one conviction. We want to expand that space with human dignity. And human dignity should be our compass. And human dignity begins with truthfulness. And to understand China truthfully, we must go beyond, to see China from inside out. So that's why I often say within Center for China Analysis, to see the real China, we must go beyond. We must go beyond the false binary of hawks or doves, because competition and cooperation can coexist. To go beyond seeing and calling everything a security threat. To go beyond the mirror imaging and assuming each other see the world the way we do, and to go beyond treating US-China relationship as a zero-sum game, but to see it as a shared human project. And we need to go beyond headlines to flatten over 1 billion people into one single storyline, when we need to go beyond the fear-based narrative and mindset to take away dignity from humanity. We need to go beyond what is easy to say, but to start facing what is true and truthful. And only when we go beyond and face the truth, we can see human dignity and open that middle ground and to see what is possible. CCA is built in that spirit. Our report, China 2026, is written in that spirit. And our program today is built around that spirit as well. So today, we're going to begin with 6 spotlight presentations. Each will look inside out of China from that spirit. Then we'll move into 2 deep Q&A with 2 excellent moderators, Gaudi Espting and Jennifer Chu. Then we're going to a big picture conversation with Ian Brahma to explore whether the world is moving towards G2, G0, or something in between. And finally, we have some reflections from always truthful Gary Shao to help us navigate our shared future forward. And your participation is truly valued. So please submit your questions through the QR code on the screen. And as last year, we will pick someone to be rewarded with the CCA Inside Out analysis and Inside Beijing Beltway for the year to go. And for someone was rewarded last year, he or she was actually blessed with some insights to make some very smart investment decision. So thank you for your curiosity, your thoughtfulness, and your commitment to this community. So now let me introduce the first speaker, Neil Thomas, who is a fellow of Chinese politics, our pillar head, who is also a co-pilot of our Decoding Chinese Politics project with me. Neil has a remarkable Chinese name as well, Niu Ben, which means quadruple greatness. So this morning, Neil will explain what the Chinese leadership has been doing, why President Xi has purged so many people, and why everybody at CCA is so lucky to work with me. So Neil, the stage is yours.
The empty seats behind me belong to Communist Party leaders who were purged before the recent 4th plenum. Xi Jinping has now fired more Central Committee members than anyone except Chairman Mao. To the outside world, this looks like a house of cards. It's led many to speculate that Xi is losing control of his own regime. I want to suggest a different possibility. What if these disappearances aren't a sign of weakness, but a terrifying display of strength? Even more, what if these purges are part of an attempt to rewrite the rules of politics themselves? To understand this, you have to understand a concept that Xi calls self-revolution. For decades, the West believed that as China modernized, it would inevitably liberalize. We believed that the only way to govern a successful country was freedom of speech, rule of law, elections. That is the Western operating system. And I like it. But Xi is trying to build a rival operating system. China has already defied Western expectations about economics. We said that you couldn't have long-term growth and real innovation without free markets. Beijing proved that state power could harness markets without fully setting them free. Now Xi is trying to do the same for politics. He's betting that Beijing doesn't need democracy to be effective. He's betting that what Beijing needs is just a party that is dedicated to ruthlessly policing itself. That is the essence of self-revolution. Xi wants these purges. They're a feature, not a bug. To be sure, they are often political, but Xi is not only removing rivals, he's institutionalizing a system of internal control that is designed, at least, to keep cadres accountable and to generate public legitimacy. That's because he believes, sincerely, that it was internal corruption and ideological rot that is what destroyed the Soviet Union and China's imperial dynasties. He wants his political legacy to be a communist party that can rule China forever. The big question, of course, is, can self-revolution work? On the one hand, we have World Bank data on China that shows reduced corruption and rising government effectiveness. There are studies suggesting that stronger oversight is improving policy implementation. But on the other hand, there's also good reasons for skepticism. Xi himself remains above scrutiny. Constant discipline inspections generate fear, inertia, silent resentment in the Chinese bureaucracy. And we don't know if self-revolution can survive after Xi. But I think it would be a mistake to dismiss the self-revolution experiment out of hand. China watchers like me often ask when the Communist Party might crack. But we need to consider the possibility that it keeps getting better at wielding power and inspires more strongman rulers around the world to follow its lead. Barack Obama once said that the arc of history bends towards justice. But what if the arc of history bends towards whoever can grip it the hardest? Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Neil, for providing an alternative explanation, even though sometimes that is difficult or even more difficult, at least it's not mirror imaging one. Next one, we are having Dr. Lizzie Li, our pillarhead for Chinese economy and technology, a rising star to decode Chinese economy, who has been leading our popular series on China's DeepSeek movement. Also my co-pilot of signature project for CCA, The Art of Dealing with China, a guidebook for multinational companies, but also the economy of being well, China's health industry, and many more. So Lizzie will share more light on the highlights, but also watch point of Chinese economic realities for both 2025 and 2026. Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you. Well, let me start by taking you to China's 2025 economic picture. It's a picture where you can see two truths at once. From one angle, the numbers don't look bad. Growth earlier this year beat expectations. Export held up and advanced manufacturing and technology. You actually saw real strength and some stunning breakthroughs, to be honest. But as we moved into the third quarter, the momentum began to fade. Retail, industrial production, and investment all weakened. The property sector is still in this long and awkward calm down, weighing on households and local government finance. What we are looking at is an economy that's definitely stabilizing after COVID, but not yet positioned for durable, self-sustaining, and robust path of long-term healthy growth. It's a recovery with many bright spots, but also a soft center. And what's critically missing here, I think, is confidence. Households are cautious about spending. Private firms are cautious about investing, not just because of domestic demand issues, but also because of scars from past regulatory crackdowns. Global markets are cautious. Trade, ever more politicized and contested. That brings me to the key question heading into 2026. If the old investment and export-centered growth model has reached its limit, what should we be watching next? Let me highlight 4 critical watch points for 2026. First, fiscal policy. It will be the main stabilizer for this year. But how much of that spending will flow into healthcare, childcare, education? Areas that are not just welfare issues, but the fundamental economic infrastructure for healthy growth. Also, Beijing needs tighter oversight of its finance, especially local government debt. So this is a driver trying to press the accelerator and the brakes on fiscal expenditure at the same time. That's a tough issue. Second watch point, household demand. Beijing now openly acknowledges that there's a structural gap in domestic consumption. Are we going to see the same old, trade-in subsidies, vouchers, or will Beijing finally get serious about the fundamentals, such as genuine income security, more robust social safety net? The thing is, people need confidence that jobs and incomes are secure in order to open up their wallet. Third, property. Well, no one expects China to return to its old growth engine of real estate. The focus now is on managing a long and painful lending. Is China doing enough? Or is China destined to run the full course of a property market correction? Internationally, this can last anywhere between 8 years to 20 years, and China is only in year 5. It's going to be a long, painful process. And finally, industrial policy 2.0. This is where we are seeing the most interesting recalibrations. China is now talking openly about the downsides of evolution, wasteful subsidies, destructive price wars, and there's a clear rhetorical pivot toward orderly competition. Also, the frontier industries Beijing's prioritizing, quantum, tech, chip, bio, requires genuine 0 to 1 breakthroughs. And those are harder, much harder to engineer into existence through industrial policy alone. So the deeper question is, can the party state be the engine of true breakthrough innovation? To conclude, I think there are 4 cross-cutting tensions that will define the year ahead. You can find more in our China 2026 report. First, how Beijing manages its relationship with the private sector. Second, how Beijing manages its relationship with international stakeholders. Will made in China be made too much in China, the much debated overcapacity issue? Third, the transition between the old and the new growth engines. The emerging industries cannot scale up overnight and replace property markets soon. And finally, most critically, how Beijing deals with its own bureaucratic system. It's kind of like an orchestra. Beijing writes the musical scores, setting the priorities, but each segment of the bureaucracy plays its own instrument as its own tempo. Implementation happens across localities with very different economic realities and incentives. So as we look toward 2026, the story is not one of crisis or triumph. It's not black or white. It's a story of transition, trade-offs, and tensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. Very sophisticated presentation about how Chinese economy is going to evolve. We will keep decoding Chinese economy and technology throughout year 2026, which is the design of the report. We will track our predictions throughout the year. Our next presenter is our pillowhead in national security and foreign policy, Lyle Morris, a very strong voice of deterrence, leader of our Taiwan policy database, also our PLA watch on Substack. Lyle will present Beijing's core decision-making variables for non-peaceful resolution regarding Taiwan. Lyle, the stage is yours.
What would compel Xi Jinping to use force against Taiwan? And why hasn't he done so yet? This is a question analysts like myself and leaders in Washington, D.C., Taipei, and elsewhere no doubt spend a lot of time pondering. And this was the focus area of my China 2026 chapter. As much as I would like, I don't have telepathic powers to read Xi's mind, but I believe these 8 factors shown here provide us with a basic formula for understanding the macro-level factors, the most fundamental variables that Xi will consider in contemplating using force to reunify Taiwan with mainland China. These are broken down into 2 categories, internal factors in orange and external factors in blue. First, at the top, PLA readiness. This includes capabilities, training, and personnel of the Chinese military to successfully pull off a Taiwan contingency. Domestic stability, the overall economic and social strength of the Chinese system and CCP rule over Chinese society. Third, leader legacy. In this case, bringing Taiwan back into the fold is one of Xi's most important long-term goals. He would like nothing more than to be the leader of China that reunifies Taiwan with China, peacefully if possible. Taiwan intent. Does Xi believe Taiwan aims to permanently seek or hold a separate sovereign status from China? China's external environment, to include major geopolitical shifts, to include contingencies like the war in Ukraine. The role of the U.S. military. What is the Chinese perception of the role of U.S. military intervention on Taiwan's behalf? U.S.-Taiwan relations. What are China's views of the overall trend line in U.S.-Taiwan relations, to include leader-level visits, exchanges, and arms sales? And finally, U.S. allies and partners. What are Chinese perceptions of the willingness of U.S. allies and partners to intervene in a Taiwan conflict? You might have read the news about the Prime Minister of Japan referencing this recently, which led to a conflict and a standoff between Tokyo and Beijing. So in totality, I believe these are the most important factors that Xi would consider in deciding to use force against Taiwan. Not all the factors, but I believe the most important. So if you were to take all these factors and rank them in importance, I believe there's 2 primary drivers for Xi that he considers most in contemplating using force. The first is the role of U.S. military, and the second is the intent of Taiwanese leaders. Why do I say this? In Xi's mind, the single most important variable that could derail a successful Taiwan contingency is the U.S. military. The only power in the world with the capacity to deny Chinese military success is the U.S. military. Xi is highly attuned to this factor. And second, Taiwan intent. Xi believes currently in Taiwan, under DPP leaders previously Tsai Ing-wen and now Lai Ching-te, have been pushing a Taiwanese identity distinct from that of the PRC. This is of great concern to Xi in China, because the existence of a separate sovereign state outside the PRC challenges Xi's core goal that Taiwan will inevitably be reunified with China. Finally, regarding secondary factors, I would just point out the PLA is in the midst of one of the largest purges in recent memory, which I believe is affecting PLA readiness for a Taiwan contingency. In other words, while the PLA has formidable capabilities, the issue of personnel in the PLA and trust from Xi towards his generals is eroding his confidence that the PLA can successfully execute a Taiwan contingency. In closing, I do not think an invasion is imminent. It still represents a major geopolitical risk for Xi and for the global community. But these factors, which I cover in detail in my China 2026 chapter, I believe are the key watch points going forward in 2026 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyle, for coining the Morris equation on Taiwan today. I want to set the record that we welcome all sorts of equations on Taiwan contingency to allow 百花齐放, right? To allow all sorts of ideas to be on the table. But the CCA's standing is we have a project called Avoidable War. We want to do everything possible to avoid a war between US and China over Taiwan and to seek anything that is peaceful. Now we will invite our guest moderator and the partner of CCA for a long time, Goldie Epstein, senior editor at The Economist, to join us and with the three presenters to get back on the stage. But before we starting the discussion, let's see some of the polling result. Question number one is about Chinese economy. Can China truly revive its private sector and entrepreneurs in 2016? The view is pretty mixed. So some food for thought for you, Goldie. Next one, please. I think it's about Taiwan. How do you assess the outlook of cross rate stability in 2026? Heightened tensions seems to be equal as manageable tensions. So you have some Tai Chi to play, my friend. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Chen-Jing, and thanks to the Asia Society for having me, and it's great to see some familiar faces and to be back on this stage. And to greet you guys, what really fascinating presentations. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to go into a lightning round here. And I'll go in the order that you guys gave presentations. One thing that we were discussing beforehand is, the thing about China analysis is you come up with these fancy analytical frames, and then you make predictions, and they end up being the status quo will continue. And of course, in the case of elite politics, there's actually a further layer to that, which is, I agree with your premise that, Neil, that we can often interpret elite actions as signs of weakness, especially repressive actions. And yet they can end up being indicators of strength or sources even of strengthening. And it occurs to me that the analysis that China's doing authoritarianism in a smart way has been one that we've seen over the last couple of decades. It's kind of modified and adapted, if you will, to whoever is in power. So 20 years ago or 15 years ago, we had kind of authoritarian adaptation, authoritarian resilience, authoritarian responsiveness. And now with Xi Jinping, we have a different kind of framing of smart authoritarianism, doing it in a different way, both of which drew on the lessons of the Soviet failure. And I was wondering, can you address sort of the concern or the sort of critique that we just overfit the current state of play to make our analysis? And for instance, we just say, well, CCP is still in power, so what they're doing is smart.
Thanks, Gary. I think that's a fantastic question. And I think it really gets to one of the weaknesses of political science, which is that politics is not science. And so we're constantly trying to catch up with what's happening and kind of retrofit our explanations, update our priors to account for a changing reality that is so subject to contingency and human factors that it's very hard to pin down. I would say that, though, that on your point, I think a lot of the think tank and academic and policy thinking about Chinese politics now is that Xi is really weakening the system, right? Authoritarian resilience looked at how there were now term limits for leaders and how various parts of the sharing of power was being institutionalized. And now that kind of model of Chinese politics has gone out the window with Xi in power. And I think there's a growing sense in the analyst community that this is going to end poorly and that whatever comes after Xi is going to kind of snap back to something that maybe we would prefer to see, a more liberal, a more plural China, a China that's more interested in working with the United States. And that's very possible, right? I mean, it's, the future's famously hard to predict, but I think what I was trying to do with my presentation and some of the other work that I've been doing is to kind of question that premise and that, well, maybe this is a very serious agenda, the self-revolution agenda, trying to formalize and regularize how the party works itself. It doesn't get nearly enough attention compared to what it should and compared to how much time Xi himself spends on this and what he says about how important it is. But, I think it's not impossible that maybe on balance it works. And so that's kind of why I wanted to focus on self-revolution today.
And thank you for that, Neil. Lizzie, one thing that didn't come out specifically in your presentation, but I wanted to ask you to kind of broaden out, or to provide context basically for, is we've heard a lot in the last couple of years about the malaise of the younger generation, that they lack optimism and their pessimism could have an impact on the kind of economic forecasts and political economic forecasts you're making. Could you address how that fits in?
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right that the macro sentiment in China is quite soft, as I mentioned. The broader job aspect facing today's young generation is quite grim. But let me just caveat that statement a little bit. I think there's a very important cohort effect at the frontier, a younger wave of entrepreneurs, the tech bros, if you will, of Hangzhou and Shenzhen. They're not particularly interested in politics. They're not especially worried about the 国进民退 narrative, but they are deeply energized by the new opportunities, by AI, by the new technologies. And now they have the commercial incentives, they have the market potential, they have the capital funding, they have the political tailwinds from Beijing, all aligned in their favor. And there are many of them, well, as you can imagine, clustered in a few sectors: robotics, AI, adjacent deep tech fields. And now they are really, really optimistic. So that's kind of the other side of the narrative. And also, it's not just this young generation cohort at the frontier, it's also the big techs. Giants like Alibaba, ByteDance. Despite all the regulatory scars of the past few years, they are still very technologically strong and financially deep. Now, they are re-architecturing their entire business model surrounding AI plus cloud infrastructure, not platforms, not social media, not consumer finance. And they can do that precisely because they have the financial resources. They have the hardware and software infrastructure. They have the vast domestic customer market, existing customer bases. They have the talent pools, they have the engineering pools, and they are able to attract the smartest people in China. And now, political risks significantly lower for them now. So both the entrepreneurs and the big techs, that's sort of the counterpart of the Malays story. And Beijing, as I argue in my chapter, is trying to channel that entrepreneurial energy into a few strategically aligned sectors with institutionalized political limit and boundaries. I think that's a bargain to offer, and I think that's incredibly interesting to watch. So the way I would frame this is this. The Malays story is real, and I think perhaps more critical. But the way I imagine is the frontier of China's pyramid defines the height of the pyramid, of the structure. The Malays story shapes the foundation, the base. The real question is whether that pyramid structure can remain stable with a weak foundation, but a really high peak. I think that's very much the tension going into 2026.
Really interesting. Well, it doesn't sound promising as a long-term structure, but maybe okay for 2026. Now, Lyle, one of the great status quo will continue predictions of all time that would have held for the last 70 years is China will not invade Taiwan next year. Of course, during Xi Jinping's time, I think people's thinking about this has changed first with umbrella movement, then what happened to Hong Kong with the national security law. People have looked at Taiwan a little bit differently and how Xi Jinping might look at Taiwan differently. And the question is, or at least I would say the assessment that people like me have been making in that last decade is that he might want to achieve that legacy, to make that legacy achievement during his time in power. Now, since he seems to want to be president for life, that's quite a long time, potentially. And so like 2035, he's going to be in his early 80s. And I'm wondering, are you looking that far ahead when you're thinking about that pillar, legacy? You know, is it realistic that he, barring all the other factors, might want to kick the can down the road? Of course, you can't read his mind. And how do you look at the various dates? There's Party Congress in 2027 and also a readiness date of 2027 that we know about for the PLA. And then 2035, moderate prosperity and, and then of course 2049, the centennial. So how do you think about these dates and about Xi's longevity as you kind of fit this into your frame?
Yeah, so as I alluded to in my remarks in my chapter, I think, short term, I'm quasi-optimistic. I don't think that she understands the gamble, it would, the risk of taking action on Taiwan. And so, the status quo is stable in the short term. I think long term, there's a lot of concerning signs, as you alluded to. First is the existence of another political party in Taiwan, the DPP, right? So China's always historically dealt with the KMT. They've been comfortable with that, and now you have democratization in Taiwan and you have another political party. It just so happens that DPP is much more forward-leaning when it comes to speaking openly about Taiwan's democracy and place in the world. And so you have, three sides, right? So Taiwan, you have Lai, who she does not like and thinks is pushing an independence agenda. And he's saying very progressive stuff. I mean, he said that China is a foreign hostile force. I mean, no Taiwanese president has ever said that. So that's very kind of, if you're in Beijing, that's a very, pessimistic and bad trend line as far as Taiwan. And the U.S., from Beijing's perspective, Beijing believes the U.S.'s one China policy is basically hollowed out. It doesn't mean much to Beijing. So even though we say it and repeat it in official statements, Xi and Beijing, leaders don't really believe it. They think that we're moving the goalpost, right? And then in D.C., we believe, many officials in D.C. believe that, China's moving the goalpost. So it's like, and then you have military coercion. The PLA is, increasing its military coercion around Taiwan. So, the fundamentals are eroding. As far as watch points, I think the next election in Taiwan is crucial because you've had 3 now successive DPP presidents. Beijing is really having a hard time figuring out how to engage with the DPP. I mean, they don't repeat many of the frames that Beijing likes when it comes to One China, right? So their mark is very high for if you don't meet that mark, they're just going to shut down engagement. So the problem with that is what's Beijing's long-term strategy? They want to win the hearts and minds. They don't, as I said, they don't want to use force, but they don't have many levers at their disposal to influence Taiwan. And so that's why they're leaning on the military instrument, which unfortunately does, works at cross purposes with its policy in Taiwan, because Taiwanese people see that, they see coercion, they see intimidation, they don't see Beijing is like working on kind of political, peaceful ways to reunify with Taiwan. So you definitely have a predicament. I think it's going to get worse. So as I said, 2028 is a key watch point for who's elected in Taiwan, who is the next U.S. president. And then, as far as the military milestones, 2027 has never been explicitly about invading Taiwan. There have been U.S. officials who have said, that there's some relationship between that, but it's not been explicit. So I don't personally worry that 2027 is some timeline that she is working on, but I think 2049 is absolutely the timeline when, the centennial of China. I think as you get closer to 2049, there's going to be increasing pressure to have some kind of results when it comes to Taiwan. So short-term optimism, long-term pessimism.
Well, she will be in his mid-90s then. And of course, his father lived a long time, so perhaps. Neil, I think we have time for a little bit of follow-up here. Speaking of 2027, the Party Congress, much has been made of Xi not having named a successor. Can you tell me, what do you expect out of the Party Congress? Do you expect to see any sort of signs of a successor, and why not?
I do see what you did there. I think the point about Xi betting on his own longevity is a really good one, right? I mean, his father, who smoked 2 packs a day for most of his life and didn't mind the odd baijiu here and there. He lived till his late 80s. His mother, Qixin, is still alive at 99, I believe. So the guy's got good genes, even if he's not looking like the picture of health every day on the front of people's dailies. So I feel like she also subjectively believes that he has a lot of unfinished business. I mean, not just the self-revolution agenda, there's Taiwan, there's this economic transition that has been very difficult, but which does have, as Lizzie's outlined, some real policy thinking behind it, kind of trying to fix what in his view was quite a broken and failing China that he inherited in 2012. So I think that we are unlikely to see any concrete signs of a succession plan at this party congress. Future party congresses is a bit more open. We'll see, obviously, how Xi's health holds up. But I think maybe the most interesting watch point for 2027 that feeds into some of these succession considerations is what Xi does with traditional age norms. It used to be that if you hit 68, and you were on the Politburo, you were out if you're 68 or older at a party congress. At the last party congress in 2022, the 20th, we had a small number of prominent exceptions to that rule. So Wang Yi, the foreign minister, Zhang Youxia, the top general in the PLA. But most people did retire on schedule per the old norms. So the question for me is, do we see a lot more of the top leaders around Xi, people he's engineered into place, that he's worked with closely earlier in his career, Li Qiang, Cai Chi, He Lifeng, do they get exceptions? And does the leadership look similar to what it does today after that 21st Party Congress in 2027? Or does Xi clean house and promote a new kind of half generation of top leaders who maybe he's less familiar with personally, but who have, survived and imbibed the 15 years of Xi's rule by that point. It's an open question, I think, at this point, but I think that's going to be the next big watch point for who might the successors be in 10, 15, 20 years.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on the Party Congress where you dined? Would you have something you want to say, Lizzie? Okay, because I have a couple questions from the audience, and I will go to the one that's most newsy here, and this is for you, Lyle. Anybody can, of course, address this. What does the recent China-Japan spat in response to Takaichi's Taiwan comment tell us about the future of East Asia security?
It tells us that history matters and it's still relevant. I think we as Americans tend to forget the history of China-Japan wars and animosity. And I guess in a simplistic framing, I think Japan is, really wants to kind of turn the page, and China still has a lot of resentment about it. And you're seeing that now. And it really, the Prime Minister of Japan's comments just struck a chord. So I think what it suggests is, short term, there's always the potential for history to kind of, rear its head again and be relevant. And I think you saw the PLA do these exercises to include a joint strategic bomber patrol with Russia near Japan. So there's a lot of interesting factors how, China's kind of incorporating some of its allies and partners, Russia being one of them, and into sending signals to Tokyo. I think eventually it's going to die down, but I think both are going to say that neither one backed down. But it's certainly going to be a rough sledding for the Prime Minister of Japan, because she's kind of really started off on a kind of difficult footing when it comes to relations with Beijing.
We actually have one more for you. There was quite a bit of Taiwan interest. I think this is a pretty interesting one. If China were preparing to use force against Taiwan, what early indicators might appear across the economic, which you could address as well, and domestic political? I mean, either of you guys, feel free to weigh in. Military and diplomatic domains. So maybe you could be narrow in the response there.
Sure. First of all, just diplomatically, I think the key watch point is if China's formula for peaceful reunification, if they drop the peaceful. So that's just like long term. If that happens, I think that things are looking dire. There will be clear indicators when it comes to mobilization, exercises, rhetoric from Beijing. So this is not going to be a bolt out of the blue. We're not going to be caught off guard by this. So I'm not necessarily worried that it's going to happen overnight and we're just going to be caught off guard. I think there's going to be weeks of kind of ramping up. We'll have clear indicators. We in Washington D.C. will, it won't be out of left field, but it will be definitely something that we would have to work with our allies partners on coordinating with.
Is this something that fits into your analysis, looking at risks for the economy?
One word, two words: supply chain. That's where you see movement. And if there's no movement across supply chains, I think risks are relatively low.
And Neil, in elite politics, what do you look for? I mean, is there anything related, whether it's related to run up to the Party Congress, or actually the recent purges, which you touched on a bit? Obviously, quite a few. I mean, the purges in the military, as Lyle referenced, I would say the recent round was a surprise because there was already a previous couple rounds of purges. I was wondering how that kind of fits into your thinking about Xi's kind of political outlook for domestic, whether it's for domestic political in relation to Taiwan or otherwise.
Yeah, I think on the Taiwan piece, I think it is an important factor in the near term, at least. If you were to do anything toward Taiwan, whether that's a full invasion or a blockade or a quarantine, it's a pretty sophisticated joint operation. So all the different branches of the military, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Cyber Force, the Rocket Force, all have to work together. And fundamentally, yes, there's lots of drones and fancy systems, but people are making decisions and people are coordinating to do a very complex task, the most complex military operation since the D-Day landings in 1944. probably more complicated. And so if you don't have people in those positions who are familiar with those positions, who know how to work with each other, who have the trust of the top leader, then I certainly think that makes you much less likely as Xi Jinping to press the button on anything really outside of what we've seen up to this date. So I think that, yes, it does have an impact, but it doesn't have much of an impact on the PLA's military modernization itself. It's more like, do you feel politically comfortable actually using all of those really fancy new weapons that you've made for yourself?
Well, I think what you're all saying is the status quo will continue in 2026. And on that note, thank you so much to all three panelists. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Gotti, for that really great panel, such a fascinating discussion. I encourage everyone here to pick up a copy of China 2026, What to Watch. That's outside, because you'll get an even more complete and complicated picture of all the things that you heard about right now. I'm Jennifer Chu, Director of Research and Strategy at CCA, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you three fantastic speakers and panel members. We'll be talking about something that's a little bit different from what we just heard, forces from the bottom up, social forces, that Lizzie touched upon a little bit, the soft center, the malaise that might be at the foundation of what China is building. So Barclay Bram will be talking about what he's been researching for a while on youth alienation, youth unemployment, and sort of the social forces that is shaping the policymaking within the halls of power in Beijing, as, of course, those policies are shaping and steering that demographic. And they will have Dr. Bob Lee come up to talk about public health and some of the fragility of that system and the inequities and what the country might be doing about that. And then third, from Li Shuo, about the forces of Mother Nature, climate change, and where China might be internationally in that as the US withdraws. I will go ahead and introduce everyone as they come up and give their backgrounds. But in the meantime, let me welcome Barclay Bram, whose names you might be familiar with already. He's a senior producer of the Weekend Intelligence at The Economist, a close colleague of Gotti, who just moderated that fantastic panel. And he will be talking to us about youth unemployment, alienation, and what's happening on the ground. So Barclay Bram.
2025 was an impressive year for China on the global stage. It stared down America in the trade war, showcased its stranglehold on critical minerals, and the term a deep-seek moment has extended beyond AI to sectors as diverse as pharmaceuticals and robo-taxis to describe the sudden realization of Chinese technical prowess in any given field. But yet, for all the power it projects abroad, from a societal perspective, China appears increasingly hollow. I'm Barclay, a fellow in Chinese society here at the CCA. For the last few years, I've been working on youth unemployment. Since the pandemic, youth unemployment in China has officially fluctuated around 20%, but many believe the figure to be much higher. With it has come a diverse language that young people use to describe their anomie, with terms like involution, lying flat, or letting it rot. And inequality continues to be a huge problem. According to the 2024 Hurun Global Rich List, China had more dollar billionaires, with 814, than the United States. At the same time, more than 200 million Chinese people are working precarious jobs in the gig economy. And that's why 2025 saw plenty of anger online against people flaunting their wealth and using their positions to advance their families' careers. And this was happening against a backdrop of Gen Z protests around the world, which have seen, for example, Nepal's parliament torched, and in Bangladesh, the prime minister's residence looted, and young protesters lounging on the canopied bed of the fleeing president of Sri Lanka. The point is, when young people no longer believe in their future, they can take things into their own hands. So, should Xi Jinping be worried? Not to echo Gadi's point too much, but maybe not right now. I think 2026, the status quo may well continue. And that's because the CCP's dominance over narrative and its coercive capacity and its elite control give it resilience against systemic shocks. Nepal's Gen Z protests were catalyzed by social media. They even held an election on Discord after toppling the government. And that's really unlikely in China due to the huge investment that has been made in controlling the Chinese internet. Given the risks involved in protest, people compete ever more ferociously for the supposed stability of the system. There are more CCP members than ever, record numbers of people taking the exams to become civil servants, and incredible competition in exams for postgraduate study. This competition makes young people more conservative and risk-averse, and therefore easier to control. But simmering frustrations about the economy and the future are serious issues that will come to define Chinese governance in the long term. Before 2014, in representative national surveys, most respondents attributed inequality to individual failings in an ascendant China. If they hadn't made it, they blamed themselves. But by 2023, however, the majority saw inequality as a structural issue related to unequal opportunity, corruption, and a stagnant economy. In the face of a sluggish economy, many people are less willing to accept a system that they see as unfair. So for all the strength that China is able to project abroad, unless it finds a way to improve the lives of its young people and give them a stake in their future, its biggest challenges might well end up being at home.
Fantastic, Barclay. Thank you for giving us that snapshot of what's happening on the ground and also connecting up to what's happening internationally. Next, we have Dr. Bob Lee, who's a senior VP at AstraZeneca and also head of global medical affairs in oncology. And he's also senior fellow at CCA, working on our Cure for Cancer project. We're delighted to have him to talk about public health and where that might be heading today and also into the future and some of the international collaboration possibilities. So, Dr. Bob Lee.
Thank you, Jennifer. So in 2020, China had declared the eradication of extreme poverty throughout all of China. And that's by the China definition of living on less than $2.30 a day, which is on par with the World Bank definition approximately. While many can argue this is a fairly low bar, but this is a historic achievement, bearing in mind that 40 years ago, this is a country where 90% of people in rural China are living in extreme poverty, and now lifting hundreds of millions of people outside of that extreme poverty is really a historic humanity achievement. However, as you may be reading through our China 2026 report, behind China is a country in ascendancy, but beneath that is also a contradictory system of constant tensions. So behind that victory, achievement, and ascendancy, we are also seeing increasing healthcare inequality. In fact, recent studies have shown that catastrophic healthcare expenditure, CHE, which is defined as more than 40% of household financial capacity being spent on healthcare alone, and that's really leading into medical bankruptcy for many households. This number is somewhere between 22% to 33% in all of China, approximating 1 in 3 households. And in rural China, numbers of 44% are being published. And so with this growing inequality, this is really a major barrier to China achieving its Healthy China 2030 goals. And as a physician who's also practiced here just across the streets, a couple blocks at MSK for over a decade, I can say this is not just a Chinese problem, but also an American problem and a problem worldwide, where healthcare bankruptcy is really a real issue. So as Jing and I had co-founded the Cure for Cancer movement together with the Honourable Kevin Rudd and with strong support from our trustee Gary Reichel, in advancing international collaboration on clinical trials to cure cancer. We also hit with a bottleneck of healthcare inequity, where fewer than 5% of patients actually get access to the very best of the best, which is the key to curing cancer, that is clinical trials, where more than 90% of patients miss out. This is a bottleneck where pharmaceutical industries are investing more than $80 billion a year, and then getting a net return of a slow pace innovation up to 10 years of timeline, or 15 years sometimes, between drug discovery into drug development and approval onto the market. This is an unsustainable healthcare ecosystem where really advancing health equity is not only the right thing to do, but a business strategy for the industry. So since I joined AstraZeneca about a year ago, one of the things I'm really proud of the company is really its commitment to healthcare ecosystem transformation. In contrast to self-revolution, AstraZeneca has openly communicated that we are on track to revolutionizing cancer care. As I lead medical affairs, we also have the medical affairs revolution spirit, Mars. So I tell my people we're going to Mars, but this is not the Mars of Elon Musk. This is the medical Mars. This is the Mars for the patients. This is a revolution where we invest not just in drug development, but also in healthcare ecosystem, in early cancer detection screening, in precision timely and diagnosis, in guideline concordant care, not just for the select few, but for the entire system, for wherever patients live, and also shaping the patient experience so they don't have to jump through hoops and go through agony just to get quality healthcare. This is with the healthcare ecosystem, health equity lens for all patients. And this, we believe that by investing in the system, our medicines will have the greatest impact on patients. And of course, that will serve to advance the business. And that's why Mars and ecosystem shaping is not just for AstraZeneca, it's for all other companies, it's for nonprofits, it's for hospitals and policymakers. It's really, it belongs to all. This is rising tide lifting all boats. So while we wait for Hudson Chen's 2060 presidential campaign on prosperity, I would argue that today, common health is the key to achieving common prosperity in China. And at the recent meeting just a few months ago, President Xi hosting global private company CEOs, including the CEO of AstraZeneca, Pascal Soriot, this is a quote from him. This 人类卫生健康共同体, which is really a shared future. Healthcare is a shared future for mankind. And therefore, healthcare is really not just for China, but also a bridge between China and the rest of the world, including the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. You are taking us to Mars, and you've been a tireless advocate and collaborator on Cure for Cancer, which tries to eradicate the plague of cancer around the world. So next we have up, last but not least, Li Shuo, who is the director of China Climate Hub at ASPE, and also senior fellow on climate at CCA. He's here to talk to us about China's climate positioning, even as China withdraws. And he's a long-time observer of China's climate policies, energy transition, as well as how to work effectively in international communities so they can engage more effectively with China as well. So help me welcome Li Shuo.
Thanks, Jennifer. I want us to imagine this. The largest carbon emitter in the world also happens to be the most important and most significant clean tech superpower. Wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries. China now produces more of them than any other country in the world. And in 2026, how China decides to deploy that power will significantly shape our planet's climate future. But here's the puzzle. Will China's emissions slow down, and it deploys clean power in unprecedented speed in human history? Beijing's leaders remain very cautious in embracing international climate leadership. What explains this paradox are two competing forces running in opposite directions. On one hand is China's industrial strength, in particular in the clean tech sector. The country now produces 80% of the solar panels in the world, 75% of EV batteries, and 60% of wind products. This is not rhetoric. These are all concrete production capacity and projects on the ground. But on the other hand, Beijing remains very cautious about international leadership narratives. The country's leaders are very worried about a slowing down domestic economy. And on top of that, China is still heavily reliant on coal, the most polluting and carbon-intensive fossil fuel. So how does China reconcile this duality between its clean tech strengths and political conservatism? In 2026, I think what we will see is China will continue to talk less and do more. What I mean by this is we will continue to see that Chinese leaders shy away from a symbolic competition for international climate leadership, but focus their minds on what they know the best: industrial innovation, commercial expansion, and also trade flows. We will see next year China's emissions very likely going to peak several years ahead of schedule. In the upcoming 5-year plans, Chinese leaders will propose modest but achievable climate targets. Most important of all, Chinese companies in the clean tech sector will push and penetrate even deeper into the Latin American, South Asian, and African markets. In other words, the Chinese climate leadership will be by accumulation, not proclamation. And this sets the Chinese leadership style very much aside from the Western style. It features a much more lower profile, pragmatic, and commercial-oriented style. And that leadership style, I think, also presents two fundamental questions to the rest of the world. The first one is, how does the rest of the world, in particular the West, work with a very different polity, which is China, following a much more pragmatic and low-profile style? The second one, just in light of China's industrial dominance, how will Western leaders decide to interact with that? Will they follow a closed-door policy, believing that a protected domestic market will eventually facilitate alternative industrial champions at home? Or will they try to somehow learn and benefit from Chinese know-how, products, and investment? Unlike other geopolitical questions and challenges that we were talking about this morning, climate change is a time-sensitive global crisis. It requires urgent action and intervention. Let's hope in 2026 we'll get timely clarity, both from China in terms of how it sees its evolving international responsibilities, but also from the rest of the world on how they interact with China's industrial strengths. Thanks.
Thank you, Li Shuo. We have gotten some insights into topics that I think don't make the headlines as often in the news and broadcast abroad. So fascinating beginning to a conversation that we're going to have. But before we do that, we're going to turn to you to find out what the polling results are for questions that are actually very directly relevant for what our speakers just said. So despite strategic competition, do we think that U.S.-China collaboration in public health in 2026 is both possible and necessary? The overwhelming answers are either strongly agree, it's disagree or strongly disagree. So is it both possible and necessary? So both agree and disagree. Oh, interesting. almost in even keel there. So I think we'll dig into that as we go into our conversation. And then next, how likely is meaningful social unrest or political instability in China in 2026? Unlikely and very unlikely, taking the lead. Sounds like, Barkley, you'll convince our audience. So with that in mind, let me call our panelists up to the stage so we can dig in deeper to the topics that they have introduced. So thanks, everyone. Going into topics like social instability or youth unemployment, and then on public health in China and cure for cancer, different kinds of international collaborations that might be possible. And then Li Shuo going into climate change and where China might be in relationship to the US and what we might do, the implications thereof. So I know that we are moving very fast in this program, and so I'm going to do a fairly rapid response, rapid set of questions. So Barkley, you gave us a picture of one end of the spectrum, which is about the youth, the Gen Z. But we also know that in China, on the other end of the spectrum, there is a demographic decline. In fact, some people call it a demographic cliff, an aging society. So can you help us square the circle in terms of, you're talking about stubbornly high youth unemployment, but the workforce is presumably shrinking. What's going on there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems like a paradox, right? You have an aging population, but you also have youth unemployment at the same time. And I think in this case, there is an element of this which is China-specific. So you have aging populations all over East Asia, but in China, the average age of workers is 40. In Japan, it's 50, and Japan has the highest proportion of workers aged between 60 to 69 anywhere in the world. In Europe, you can look at Germany also has the median age of workers is very close to 50. So in China, you have it is an aging population. The trend line is really severe, but it's hurtling towards the cliff. It hasn't fallen off the cliff yet. And at the same time, it is overproducing graduates. So this year, you have 13 million undergraduates, the highest graduating cohort in Chinese history. And so they are entering a job market in which, the average age of workers is 40, which means they still have, even though retirement age is lower in China than elsewhere, they still have, a decade, 2 decades of work ahead of them. So there isn't the replacement, and you have this flood of graduates, and there just aren't enough jobs that can match, this wave of graduates that come into the market. So you have a lot of structural issues here at play, all focusing, and in particular over the next kind of 5 to 10 years, it's going to really bite.
Yeah, so you predicted status quo for 2026, but we'll see in 5 years, in 10 years, whatnot.
For sure, and I think in this sense, demography is very similar to obviously what Li Shuo is talking about. It's very similar to climate change. These are long-term but deeply existential problems, and because they are long-term problems, it requires long-term solutions and long-term planning, which can often then get lost in the day-to-day politics and the need to be reactive to global environment, changes in the economy, changes in technology. So you have to hope that the Chinese leadership is able to really resolutely hold on to that going forward over the long term.
Yeah. So turning to you, Bob, actually, you spoke about the high cost of medical care in China, how much household expenses go towards medical care. Same is actually true for education as well. So the 3 top mountains are education, medical care, and housing. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you talk about, which is common prosperity, which also has to embrace common health. So what are sort of the choke points, or what are sort of the stuck points where it's really hard to implement the inequities in healthcare delivery in China?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. It's a major problem because just in the last few years, since that elimination of extreme poverty, there's a new term that's come up backed by a lot of data is called 因病返贫, which is going back to poverty because of illness. And there is a basic universal healthcare system, 医保 in China, which does have government subsidies for healthcare, but at a very, very basic level. So if you're hit with cancer or a heart attack or a complication from diabetes, you have to fork out your own. And that's unsustainable for most households in China. And the concentration of medical care is in the largest top-tier cities in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, where patients would just, they take time off work, they got a lot of help from families, and then they rent a motel and they stay there, they line up for 6 hours just to see a doctor for 5 minutes. It's just painful. It's a lot of hurdles they have to jump through, and frankly, just not sustainable for most, not practical for most people. And just get the right medical care. Just get the right diagnosis and the right treatment. It's so hard for patients in China. And if you do, and if this is a systemic problem, it will bankrupt the country. So I think there's that Yingbing Fanping is a real problem. So as you're eliminating poverty, swaths of middle class in the hundreds of millions are going back to not extreme poverty, but relative poverty and hardship. And that renders a country going backwards. And that's a problem also faced in the United States, especially in rural America. A lot of people are angry, they're really suffering because of that. So I think investing in healthcare ecosystem, in public health, not just in the richest areas of China, but going inland China, going into the 3rd and 4th tier cities, into the county levels, where the vast majority of patients actually live, is going to render much healthcare, but also financial economic returns and productivity for the country as well. And the same goes with the US. So, and what Barclay talked about, the youth problem, the youth unemployment, there's a lot of mental health crisis that's going to occur, leads to social instability, and also in the US, political extremism as well. So I think there's a lot that the two countries, and of course other countries as well, the rest of the world can work together on.
Absolutely right. There are so many resonances in what you're saying with the problems that we're facing in this country and around the world, actually. Lizzie and others have talked about the uneven landscape in China regarding what we were just talking about, public health and youth unemployment. But let me turn to you, Li Shuo, because one of the bright spots actually is that China is a powerhouse when it comes to clean tech. EV and solar, wind, as you talked about during your spotlight presentation just now. And you talked about that very interesting phrase that their climate diplomacy, their approach is very different from that of the West. So talk less, do more. Comes from Hamilton, I think. Talk less, smile more, but in the case of China, do more. So can you tell us a little bit about what the best approach is for the West, for the rest of the world, in engaging with China most effectively that uses a more pragmatic, commercial, and manufacturing expansion?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think, look, now that we have all the sectoral presentations, and then I think an interesting observation here is when it comes to either the industrial strengths, and if you want to use the word oversupply. Right, at least in the clean tech sector, China's oversupply and hyper, competitiveness, it could in fact not be bad news, for the rest of the world. I think this particular sector that we're looking at, clean tech, is also something that is at the very forefront in terms of thinking about how the West or how the rest of the world should react to China's economic competitiveness, right? Because in this particular sector, China is indeed really leading the rest of the world by a very, very significant margin. And if anything, my prediction is that margin will be widened even more in the coming years. So this is really a very interesting and very urgent area that we need to look at. And I guess just to address your question, we are now actually seeing different responses from across the world on China's industrial dominance. One prominently cited example is Pakistan, right? They are facing severe domestic energy supply challenges. Their grid is not reliable. Coal power is actually quite expensive, and they happen to be very close to China, and they are buying a huge amount of solar panel, very cheap but good quality solar panels from China. So we see kind of one side of the spectrum, which is, well, you have cheap solar products, and we have energy supply challenges, we'll just buy them. And I think you're also seeing the other side of the aisle, which is I think best reflected here in the U.S. Trade, tariffs and investment restrictions. And I would argue, that approach is increasingly certainly not in line with the global climate interest, and whether it is actually in line with the industrial aspiration here in the U.S. That's probably also quite questionable. So how do we actually find that nuanced and balanced approach to react to China's clean tech strengths? I think this is going to be a recurring theme in the coming years, but I think every country needs to look at their national reality. They will need to look into what they need, what's in line with their national interests, and they need to deal with this issue with nuance and a balanced approach.
Great. There's a lot of need for nuanced and balanced approach in biopharma that, Bob, you look at, and then in clean tech. And so I see lots of parallels here in terms of the inequality that you talked about, and Barclay that you're also talking about. So Barclay, I'm going to turn back to you. You raised a question at the very end of your presentation that's quite provocative, which is about youth alienation, the next up-and-coming generation, their sense of their future, their sense of their place in the world, et cetera, are being shaken right now. So what do you think that means for the long-term prospect for governance, for politics in China?
Well, I think, what you see happening at the moment is the government is obviously investing a lot in social control. So you can see this year there have been bans on speaking out online about the fact that the economy isn't doing well, excessively, promoting a tongue ping or a lying flat lifestyle. So, continued social control, continued repression, and that is long-term very brittle, right? And in the extreme, the most extreme version of this is obviously what you see happening in Nepal, or as Neil said, what keeps Xi Jinping up at night is the fall of the USSR and the idea that the system could hollow out from the inside. So, the big risk is that because you have this, to also echo Lizzie's point, you have this very narrow foundation and this very high peak that is, structurally, that is not very sound. And the issue is not just the young generation that is coming through. The issue is also that these young people have parents, right? And these parents are also very upset that they're investing so much in their children. I mean, lower income families in China invest up to 50% of their household income on their children's education. So this is a huge amount of money to put into a child, often an only child, so often one child. You invest all of this money, all of this resource, all of this love, and social capital for no return, because you end up with someone who doesn't have a job or is highly overqualified and working in a gig job, and this then becomes a family problem. And so this then creates actually an intergenerational sense that, okay, the system isn't working. Because even if parents look around and they're like, well, I have a home, I've seen China develop, I've benefited from all of this infrastructure and China's global power projection, whether you see that for yourself, if you are not seeing it translate to your children, that will still frustrate you. And so it's a bigger problem than just being isolated in this young generation.
So the key word there seems to be brittle, governance becoming brittle. So, Bob, I want to turn to you for some hope, maybe, some optimism in terms of where are some of the bright spots in terms of international collaboration in biopharma and biotech, in the fields that you work on, public health, where US and China might be able to collaborate, or China and the rest of the world might be able to collaborate. Can you illuminate us on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a mindset shift. Healthcare is often seen as an expenditure from the government budget, but it doesn't have to be like that. It really should be seen from an investment mindset. So once, as a physician, I've taken care of so many patients who get cancer and they're treated, they're restored to good health, they go back to work. I have patients who went back to complete their PhDs after diagnosis of cancer, even one patient with metastatic cancer, and that's well controlled. So he went on to complete his PhD and contribute to research. Our friend Jing, who's being very open about his own personal cure for cancer journey, had his tumor eradicated, went back to restored full health, and went on to become the youngest vice president at Asia Society. I mean, this is, and he's contributing to GDP growth. I would argue. So I think from a policy lens, this is an investment in health. There's economic returns to that. What's going to happen with all these youth unemployment who are just laying flat? If you invest in capacity building, education, training, these people are going to get work, and they're going to produce. They're going to restore more patients back to work. The GDP is just going to go up and up. And there's an enormous opportunity for collaboration between countries to really expand that ecosystem. It's really the growing the size of the pie so that everyone gets to benefit. And US, China, really, it's all about people facing the common struggles. The patient's struggle is the same. And I'm an Australian oncologist who's with Chinese heritage and practiced in the US for a good decade. The struggles are the same, whether you're Chinese or you're American or Australian. It's the same struggle. So if we create an ecosystem where investment in healthcare can be throughout US and China for the benefit of patients and people, a lot of investment in prevention, in capacity building and training, especially in rural areas, in rural America, inland China, and the rest of the world, then you really create a situation where rising tide lifting all boats. The clinical trials don't have to take 10, 15 years to get a breakthrough in a new vaccine or a new antibody drug conjugate for cancer. It should be just 2 to 3 years every time, and you do these at scale. So every year or every month, you're going to get breakthrough after breakthrough. And absolutely sure, even before Hassan Chen's presidential campaign, we may see the cure for cancer, for whole of humanity if we get the world to work together.
I would love to see that day, even before Hudson Chen runs for president. So I see that the sign for ending our program is here. And Li Shuo, I know you also have in your heart the desire for greater public goods in the world. And we will end on that note, which is actually a big mission for CCA. Even in these tense times, they can work together and bring about greater good for the world and for people in it. So thank you very much.
Hello again, and many thanks to all our presenters and the panelists. We have spent the past hour or so looking at China from inside out, from politics, economy, foreign policy, society, and climate and public health. And thank you all for your shout out to Hudson for 2060. Please donate to the campaign as well. We'll set up a website very soon. And I hope you all had a chance to read China 2026 report now. And thank you for your participation in the polling. We'll bring more back very soon. It's now time to zoom out to look at the world around China and the geopolitical landscape shaping 2026, where China is operating within. And with that, I have no one better than the one and only Ian Brummer to join us, to help us to decode that. So Ian, please join me on the stage. I'll have a more proper introduction. So thank you for doing this, Ian. It's a long flight and car ride and subway ride to arrive here.
Well, as you know, I'm subbing in for my bestie Kevin. So there are worse sort of duties to fulfill.
Thank you, thank you. Even we China Center and China event, we did start today with American Dream. I've known you for more than a decade now. You embody the American Dream in so many ways. Grew up from a project outside of Boston with a single mom who was so determined and driven. Went into a fine liberal arts college, Tulane, at the age of 15. Graduate, as I know, from Stanford, studying Ukraine and Russia at the age of 24. Youngest fellow at Hoover. Then you basically broke a path and start a new field of geopolitical analysis for markets, which so many of us are benefiting from. Even our report, China 2026, was inspired partially by your top of risk report at Eurasia Group, I always wanted to ask you, Ian, let's start from there. What drives you? What gets you out of bed? How can you accomplish so much and look so young?
I don't know about the last point. I'm pretty driven. I basically have 3 speeds: fast, faster, and sleep. And people that Kevin at dinners will see that I'm like really go, and then suddenly I'm literally just down for the count in my chair. I think it's charming. I'm not sure if other people feel that way. I do think that if you come from a very modest background and you were raised well, and by well I mean by wolves, but by wolves that loved you, that it's fairly clear that if I wasn't driven and wasn't appreciative, if my mom were around, she'd smack me up the head, right? So, there is this sense of you've been given such an opportunity, you better not waste it. And I think it's often a lot more challenging for young people that apply to Eurasia Group or to Asia Society who have come from great networks and from substantial means to find where that ambition comes from, right? Mm-hmm. Because so much has been made easier for them as they've gone through. That wasn't the case for me. I'm sure you know that Kevin, we'll just talk about Kevin for a while. He grew up on a farm. And a modest farm, and no one gave him anything, and Lord knows they weren't, planning for him to be a diplomat or get a PhD or learn Mandarin or also become. He was the Australian dream, but now he's made it in New York as well, so he's the American dream too. His brother almost killed by a kangaroo when he was younger. All of these things. You think that's not true? It's actually true. He was maimed. He was maimed badly. I don't know if he was almost killed, but they're mean, those kangaroos. So anyway, so what happens when he has me do stuff and he's not here is I'm just going to give you more stories about him.
Yeah. Yes. We'll cut this particular part out and send to Kevin before we put it online. I did watch your recent tooling commencement speech very carefully. It's a great one. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend. There's quite a bit of young men and women in the audience who are Schwarzman scholars and Morningside scholars, like War Fellows. They raised a question before to me. Because you chose this field of geopolitical analysis of the market before it was a thing. So they're facing something similar, right? The major they're going to study today might not even exist in 4, 8, 10 years' time. How did you formulate that decision at that time?
It did seem, well, 2 things. First is that if you start your PhD in 1989, which is when the wall came down, those are momentous historic changes, and the idea that you're not going to study something around that seems crazy. In the same way that if you were graduating today, the idea that you wouldn't study the impact that China is having and will have on the world kind of seems crazy from a global perspective. So that was obvious. I learned Russian, right? I got to know the leaders that were at that point nascent of these former Soviet republics, many of whom eventually became heads of state. Fascinating time to be in that field. My Russian language is less useful today. The Russian government has sanctioned me, so I can't go there, which I find irritating. It's not clear why. I think they ran out of people. I wasn't on the first or the second wave. They were running out of people that were notable that worked on Russia to sanction, and so they sanctioned me. And I've had this discussion with some Kremlin advisors, and they said, well, do you want us to, we don't think there's a good reason either. Do you want us to get it off? And I'm like, well, no, I'm not going to ask you for a favor, because that even looks worse, right?
It's a badge of honor.
At this point, I'm stuck. Yeah, I just have to. But it didn't feel like a badge of honor. People said that, like Jim Stavridis, the former head of NATO, called me up. Ivo Dalder, the former NATO ambassador, they're all like, it's a badge of honor. But when you study a field and you learn the language and you get to know the people, and by the way, Russia's the largest landmass out there. So okay, there aren't many people and they don't make any money, but it's a large amount of territory. So when they tell you, sorry, you can't go there, it's kind of offensive. When they tell you can't even fly through it, right? I mean, at least if you're sanctioned from a tiny little country, you can't fly through it. Who cares? Russia, there are several trips I make a year where I have to literally really inconvenience myself just to avoid their airspace, right? Which is another reason why I want them to give back territory in Ukraine. It makes my life much more inconvenient the more land they acquire, right? I mean, it's just wrong.
Very personal, personal drive.
Yeah, yeah.
Another personal conviction.
They should also give the land back. I mean, there is that, but since you're asking about me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is very important for all your young fellows. To find your personal convictions, connect that to a bigger meaning of humanity is always works out very well, at least for Ian. You did coin one intellectual contribution, G0, which I found out to be 14 years ago.
This
is before your book. This is in the March-April issue of Foreign Affairs article, actually, in 2011.
Yep.
14 years in, are we closer to G0?
Oh my God, yes.
What are the signposts?
Well, did you read the national security strategy? I mean, this was Trump actually saying, yeah, G0's our thing, right? Like, that's what we want. We're not going to be the global sheriff. We're going to throw Europe under the bus. We don't want a strong EU. We're certainly not going to promote free trade. We're really not going to promote democracy. And we know that nobody else is going to do those things. So it's G0. I mean, when the world's most powerful country, run by a president who has consolidated more power than any president in our lifetimes, working assiduously to undermine checks and balances, goes all in on G0, then you get more G0. I mean, there are other reasons for G0. Not having integrated Russia after Soviet collapse and them being angry about it, and pretending that you were going to integrate them but then not, that's a reason for G0. Another reason is integrating the Chinese on the presumption that they were going to look more like the United States politically and economically. They become more powerful, but they're still state capitalist, they're still authoritarian. That creates more G0. But the most important is what's happening right in the United States. And so, and what's interesting is, of course, when I wrote about the G0, and this has become a real problem algorithmically, people assume that when you assess something and you believe that it is likely to happen, then that must mean that you want it to happen, which is certainly true if you listen to people on CNBC, right? I mean, that's anything that they say is something they want to happen. They're talking in their book. If you go and think about someone that's stumping for the Democrats or the Republicans, they say things they want to happen. As a political scientist, I frequently say things I do not want to happen. I mean, like I wrote a book called Superpower, and at the time, I thought it was most likely of the three, and this was about 10 years ago, of the three paths that the United States had, indispensable America, Moneyball America, or independent America, the one that they were most likely to choose was independent America, which I did not like. But who cares if I like it? I mean, that has very little to do with the analysis of what's happening in the world. I mean, what I like has more to do with who I am and who raised me and where I'm from and what my mom's like, and I'm a guy, I'm left-handed, I'm a Scorpio, whatever, right? But Scorpio being the most relevant of those things.
Me too.
But are you?
Yes.
A good man. Okay, good. Yeah, I knew there's a reason that we connected. So but what is going to happen? The G0 was for me wildly overdetermined. There were many reasons why it was extremely likely that the world was heading into a geopolitical bust cycle, a geopolitical recession. So that was not a hard call. The hard call was how long would it take? How deep would that recession get? Whether or not the crises that occur would lead to reforms in international institutions, the creation of new international institutions, or World War III. Now, those are interesting questions that I didn't make predictions about at that point, and that we can talk about. But certainly the likelihood of G0 seemed to me wildly overdetermined in 2011. Yeah.
So you mentioned about independent Americans is not somewhere you want to go, but actually we're going towards that direction.
Yeah.
And the new national security strategy is also pointing us towards that direction.
Yeah.
How sustainable you think this direction is going? Is this a Trump 2.0 thing, or does it go beyond that? It's more structural?
Well, it's structural insofar as there are lots of Americans who want these kinds of policies. So, I mean, when Barack Obama was incapable of getting the Trans-Pacific Partnership done, that reflected a problem that Trump had nothing to do with. Trump is a symptom. Trump is a beneficiary. Trump is an accelerant, but he's not the cause. Having said that, a United States with a national security strategy that is not aligned with rule of law, that is not aligned with liberal democracy, that is not aligned with being reliable for your allies around the world or shared values, this law of the jungle, the G0 world, America desiring that strikes me as strategically unwise because the United States is incapable of affecting such a policy consistently over a long period of time. The US is not China, much as Trump might like it to look more like that. It is not Russia. He is not going to rule for the rest of his life, unless he dies before 2029, which is plausible, right? He's 80. Those are realities. There are real checks and balances. If you are another country thinking about what the U.S. is now saying, one of the things that you can rely on is that it's very unlikely the U.S. will still be saying the same sorts of things in another 3 to 5 years. Yes. So it is unfortunate, in my view, that the U.S. has decided to double down on a set of policies that its own political system, federalism, checks and balances, independent judiciary, two-party system, relatively free and fair elections, is just not well situated to execute on. Yes. I think it is the type of system, like, I understand why remember the Kremlin response to this national security strategy.
Very aligned with their vision.
I mean, it was warmer than I have seen the Russians respond to any U.S. policy in a decade.
Yes.
Which should tell us there's something wrong with it. Now, if I had been advising the Russians, and assuredly I'm not, I would have told them, you don't need to be public about how happy you are, because number one, it makes you look insecure, and number two, it actually empowers some of the people inside the United States saying this is a bad thing, including some people around Trump. The Chinese, I think, were much more clever about it, which is they are extremely happy, but publicly they're studying it. And that seems to be a more secure and mature and rational and strategic way to respond to the Americans strategically self-immolating.
You speaking of China, you just came back from China and you spoke with quite a bit of Chinese senior leaders. We traveled together to China about a decade ago.
It was fun, yeah.
It was fun.
With Kevin.
Yes, and a lot of other people.
And a lot of other people. But we were the core of that group. That's the way I felt about it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of drinking. So you spoke with a lot of Chinese senior leaders. Do they feel the same about where U.S. is going? Something you said struck me recently is that the rule of jungle really favor China.
Yeah.
The rule of law system really favor the U.S. to some extent. And China...
Doesn't favor Trump.
Doesn't favor Trump.
But it does favor the U.S.
I agree. And the U.S. cannot out-compete China way. I think that is pretty obvious. But how the Chinese elites from your recent trip is seeing this is going?
Well, they love the near peer status that they are being afforded in the NSS. They also like the G2 being promoted by the United States. They won't accept it themselves because they still pretend to be in the global South and softly, and you guys are so much more powerful. But they understand that these things, in the same way that the Americans are turning away from science, the Americans are making the U.S. less attractive for talented immigrants to come in and work and drive the U.S. economy. Those are things that the Chinese understand will benefit them. They are opportunities for China, not only for China, but they are opportunities for China. So clearly, I think they understand this. They also see that this is a time for them to take advantage of stability. They took a big bet with the critical minerals that didn't have to go so well for them, but it did. It led Trump, that plus the unwillingness to get on the phone and talk after Liberation Day showed Trump that the Chinese are serious, the Chinese are strong, the Chinese are patient, they're capable of hitting him in the face. I mean, if there was something like China inside the United States, the US would be much less concerned about Trump breaking the American political system. But the Democrats don't have that equivalent, at least not as of today. And nor are there any inside the Republican Party or within the Supreme Court or the armed forces. And that's important. But China has clearly seen that their willingness and ability to stand up to the Americans has paid off. And it's paid off not only in terms of the magic beans that they're going to be buying now, which they've been extended from January to February 28th. So, you know, it continues to look more favorable for them, but also the H-200s, which, I mean, strategically makes no sense in my view whatsoever for the United States, but has the advantage of making money for NVIDIA, which effectively lobbied Trump personally. And that personal alignment clearly is more important than the long-term national interest of the United States and what is driving policy today. I disagree with that, but again, that's not the relevant point. The point is what's happening. And the Chinese want to know what's happening. They see very clearly what's happening. This is an opportunity. This is a land of opportunity diplomatically and geostrategically for the Chinese, at least for the coming months.
And I agree with you on that analysis. And you did put out very insightful framework at your quite popular TED Talk with a very courageous point, is that in the current landscape of geopolitics and great power competition, the new source of superpowers is no longer countries, it's some of the major multinational companies. How should we think about those going forward? H-200 is case in point, right?
Well, it's interesting. There was a moment, right, when in the United States where it looked like they might be hybridizing, and this was when Elon Musk, after giving more money than any individual had ever given to a U.S. presidential campaign, and that was already a high bar, then decided that they had this love fest and moved into Mar-a-Lago, and he became head of Doge, and he brought his guys in to get all the data in the different U.S. departments, and had the potential, if they could have made that work, of really becoming a technology overlord in the United States and more broadly. He failed, Doge failed, they fell out, two egos, too big for each other. He's now come back, in a sense, but has been saying in the last 24 hours, I wish I had never done Doge. Appropriately so, because AI is becoming in the West self-regulating, self-regulate head. These companies they're writing the algorithms. They are functionally sovereign in the digital space and the impact that the digital space has. The government is at best playing catch up, Europe, and at worst is being captured monetarily by those companies themselves that can make decisions that are either non-aligned with the US government or directly misaligned with the US government in the case of the H-200s. And certainly if you wanted to bet on not who's going to make more money in the next 5 or 10 years, but who's going to accumulate the most power in the next 5 to 10 years, I would be betting very heavily on government contiguous private sector technology bros in the United States. As a group, I would be betting very heavily on that group accumulating much more power, that they will determine what to do with largely by themselves. And that is problematic for a representative democracy.
So what will be things we could do as responsible either citizens, policy influencers, geopolitical analysts?
Well, Rahm did one yesterday. Rahm Emanuel,
Yeah.
who I was talking to about this, anyone under 16, he wants to ban from social media.
Australia did
Just
this.
like Australia,
Yes.
that's right, which Kevin is completely in favor of, and should be. Any parent, certainly, anyone that cares about kids. There are a number of other Western countries moving in that direction. I think it's pretty clear that you don't want these algorithms being tested real time on our population.
Sure.
You wouldn't do that with a vaccine, even in a period of pandemic. You wouldn't do that with a genetically modified food, but we're doing that with our brains. We're doing that with society. And that is, in my view, radically dangerous and only focused on short-term profitability and accumulation of power. And those business models are fundamentally misaligned with U.S. society.
Completely agree
And
with
China understands this. They're being far more cautious about rolling out AI to individuals as consumers, individuals in society. They're focusing much more on industrial uses, much more on national security uses, and much more on data sets that they have control over.
Exactly. This is getting very fast, and we're running out of time already, Ian. I have a number of questions from the audience, and I want to show you two of the polling surveys we have done on G0, if we can put them on the screen. Which one best describe the future global world over the next 3 to 5 years? G0 only got 10%.
Well, they didn't do it after my talk. Which is, if you did it now, it would go up. I feel fairly strongly about
G2,
that.
it's an illusion somehow, but it's quite talked about on media. What's the difference here? The G0, G2 on multipolar world order that has been talked quite a bit.
Well, number one, I think that all of that 26.1% in the purple is basically blue. Okay? If you think it's too early to tell, if you're really not sure, you're basically saying it's G0.
You're learning from Trump to shape the narrative.
I am. I'm trying to frame the narrative. It's because I don't think that G0 is with us forever. And I do think that there's aspects of this global security order that feels like a G1 today with the United States. Look, you can't get Gaza done unless the Americans are directly involved. But Russia-Ukraine is showing that is starting to change with the Europeans having a level of veto power. Still, if the Americans stop selling those weapons to the Europeans, game over, right? So there's a bit of a G1 on the security side. On the economic side, it is already very clearly multipolar. And in the technology side, in China, the government controls it. In the West, it's largely not geopolitical, it's technopolar, it's technology companies, which is, reflected here in the green, but is only a small piece of how we think about global power today. In 5 years and 10 years, that's going to change. So I think if you asked me about this from 10 to 20 years out, I would say it's either going to be G2 multipolarity or technopolarity. It'll be within the band of those three things. It won't still be a G0 because 10 to 20 years out, if it's still a G0, we've had a massive war. And I don't think that's likely. And I don't think it'll be too early to tell because you will have a lot more institutional, structural building, rule building, and a lot more people that are just taking power because nature abhors a vacuum. And so there are opportunities for many. It's like if you ask the Chinese now, you ask senior leaders in China now, when Trump came out and said it's a G2, right, which Biden never would have said, which Bush never would have said, he said it's a G2. You ask the Chinese, do you think it's a G2? And they smirk. Nah, it's not a G2. And then you ask them, in 10 years' time, do you think you'd be prepared to say it's a G2? And then they think about it. And they don't want to say yes because they're not allowed to say yes, but they kind of want to say yes because that's kind of where they think they're heading. I mean, there's that desire, and there's certainly that potential, given what the Chinese are presently up to. But I don't. Am I prepared to really make that kind of a bet? If any of you that read AI 2027, which is wildly too out there for the very near term, but does show some of what exponential gains in AI can mean for geopolitics, I am unprepared to make a strong call that the Chinese or the American companies are in a position to be dominant in the next 10 years. It's just too early. Right? We need revealed preferences here on what kind of models we're going to see, on how they're going to deploy those things, on what kind of backlash they have. So I do think it's too soon to tell. I'm in the purple too, but until it becomes not too soon to tell, we're basically G0.
It is a good way to put them into a band of meaning to have multiple narratives going forward. It's evolving prediction.
It is.
It is. I have quite a bit of questions. I will put them into a lightning round to finish
Okay,
our
sure.
conversation. We have to do this again if you are willing. What is the most underestimated risk for 2026?
That I would possibly answer that when our big report is coming out. in 3 weeks.
See, I teed it up for you.
Underestimated,
Look out for the top of risk 2026 from Eurasia Group. Second,
No, the most underestimated risk is that you're going to have probably that the Russians who look really strong right now suddenly have a major disruption. Their economy, the oil prices, there's been virtually no domestic dissent. The Ukrainians have tried, but they haven't been able to, sort of hit, anything close to Putin. But as they get more desperate, I'm talking about this because you won't see it in the top risk report, but there's a 5, a 10, a 15% chance that Russia goes from we're winning to something's just happened to Putin, and he breaks. And it's a major nuclear power, and they're involved in a major war. So, I mean, it's something that is underappreciated that could go really, really badly is suddenly Russia's not just at war with Ukraine. The system is open to question, and that's a NATO problem. It's a global problem. I'm quite worried about that.
Russia. It's
Yeah, but I'm not worried. It's not a baseline risk, which isn't the way we think about top
got
risk.
it.
Yeah.
Second one is that biggest risk and opportunity between U.S. and China, 2026.
Behind the scenes, it might be Taiwan because Trump doesn't care about it. So, I mean, and the Chinese really want to play ball. And there's been no one that's moved from the Trump administration, but that won't be true early next year. It'll be interesting if some of the remaining China hawks all leave. If Trump is able to say, hey, this is my win, is I'm doing a deal with these guys, well, I mean, Taiwan is even farther away from Ukraine. Does Trump care about it, right? And is he willing to do a Hong Kong type deal where the U.S. gets access to TSMC, but the Chinese get Taiwan? I mean, he is a president that uniquely would be willing to talk about that kind of thing in ways that others would not. So now, is that an opportunity? I mean, the Chinese would see it as an opportunity. Trump would see it as an opportunity. There are probably many in this room that would not. But again, that wasn't the question you asked. So I would say that it's out there.
Yeah, but this underlying logic is that the personal political interest and national interest are not always aligned.
No.
Yeah. Now, so next one is, what's your evolving prediction about the AI?
By the way, someone should do a big paper about the gap between Trump's personal interests and the country's national interests, and specifically where those things exist, where they're growing, where they're not. I think it's extremely important. I see not enough people are applauding that, by the way. That's a very, very, it's a very important thing to do because it matters for our country.
Thank you. Next question. What's your evolving prediction about AI and humanity in 5-10 years' time? AI will free human, AI will enslave human, AI will destroy human.
AI will be used by humans, none of the three. And it will be used by humans in increasingly transformative ways, including for our society, including for our individual psyche. I mean, when you have a thing that knows you better than any person in your life, you have suddenly transformed as a human being. You've become sort of hybridized with that AI. It's still you're still using it, but you're also being programmed by it. Will you be enslaved by it? No, but it's going to transform society. So I do think these things are really, really momentous, and it's hard to tell students what to do about that. 5 years ago, we were telling students learn to code. I was on Bill Maher, we were talking about that a few months ago. I said that was as bad advice as get a face tattoo. Because those are the first things that AI are actually disrupting and displacing in terms of, is that a useful career for you? Yeah. So, I mean, you need to be in positions where you can learn to use AI, but also be flexible because the world is changing too fast for you to think that you're going to go into school and have a career and that's the thing you're going to do. It seems fairly clear that's not going to be the experience for most young people, which is unnerving, it's unsettling. You know?
It is.
You know, I mean, it's not the way we think about our religion. No. It's not the way we think about our gender identity. It's not the way we think about our families, our relationships. Society tells you you've got to decide who you are and your occupation, your marital status, your gender, all these things, and that's who you are. And increasingly, our society in every way is telling young kids that is not the right way to behave. That if you do that, you will fail. Maybe you'll be okay in the eyes of these people that are dead in 10 years, but you will not have a future. And that misalignment is going to become a huge, huge challenge. And we need to allow young people to explore that. We don't need to shut them down.
No. Yeah. On that very hopeful note, thank you very much, Ian.
I think it is a hopeful note.
It is a hopeful
really
note.
is.
Very hopeful.
Absolutely.
Thank you for clarity, insights. Thank you. Thank you again, Ian. We have our last speaker, which is one of the real leaders whose career span technology, healthcare, grand strategy, and professional bridge building. He has led and invested at the highest level, from senior roles at Intel, Cisco, and funding SoftBank's venture capital and Qiming Venture Partners. Now is one of the top VC firms globally. He is also the convener of the Big Bond Dialogue, one of the most thoughtful and influential gatherings on US-China. Gary has just actually returned from China after meeting senior leaders in Beijing, more than 10 ambassadors, and countless entrepreneurs across the country. But what I appreciate most about Gary is his instinct to help, to mentor and to support and to lift other people up. I have experienced that generosity firsthand over the years, and I remain incredibly grateful. Please join me to welcome Gary Shao to delivering closing remarks.
So I should have known better when Jing said I would make comments after Ian Bremmer. It's almost as bad as talking after Kevin Rudd on China. So good day, everyone. What an outstanding morning. I want to congratulate everyone who's been involved in this, because it's really a first-class presentation, and I've certainly taken away a great deal from it. Specifically thank Jing and the Asia Society for inviting me to speak here today. And then thank everyone for dealing with the complexity of China. It's really important to establish some kind of baseline of understanding. It's going to change dramatically, but it's really important for us to try to have a common base and try to inform those of the people that we deal with in DC and other institutions of our understanding of that base. We explored many aspects of China together this morning, and a great launch event for China 2026, one to launch. I have one major takeaway this morning, which I think is really important, so I'm having to change my comments. It's always rough when you prepare comments and then you listen for 3 hours and you realize, maybe you should say some things that are different. But the whole idea of success by accumulation, not proclamation, that is something I think everyone who's dealing with the US government today should take away. We're doing an awful lot by proclamation here. And certainly the recent trip to China reinforced the accumulation as opposed to proclamation approach that they're taking in many technology areas. So the 2 weeks I spent in China, I met quite a few investors, entrepreneurs, my partners, many government officials, and other business leaders. There's no question that there are parallel economic tracks and social tracks operating today in China. To a person, government officials included, friends and colleagues commented on the difficulties in the property market and the lack of confidence by the Chinese consumer. It's the first time I've had government officials, senior government officials, specifically state that. Equally unanimously, everyone I met expressed satisfaction, pleasure, and surprise about the achievements of China's innovation ecosystem across a very wide range of technologies and business models. So there is a satisfaction, there is an appreciation of what has been achieved. And now there's a question of how that's going to be managed and evolve going forward. Government officials from the US and Europe have finally realized that they need to coordinate their approach to China's unprecedented industrial machine. We met with 10 European, 10 EU ambassadors. And shell shock is one appropriate response, and a realization that their entire EU system of 27 separate entities trying to remain a separate entity at the same time as they try to become a single entity is really not going to work in discussions with China. and it's not going to work at all in terms of the development of future technologies. What's been created in China deserves admiration and respect, but also a clear-eyed response to maintain our own business, our own broad-based supply chain resilience and healthy domestic economies. AI was mentioned in every single meeting, either in passing or as a major focus of the meetings. Even in a very senior meeting in the Great Hall of the People with Hu Lifeng, he spent 2/3 of his 30 minutes of talking points on AI, speaking about both challenges and opportunities. He was incredibly articulate, incredibly well-informed. And so one gets the sense that this is something that is a broad-based discussion across leadership in every aspect of Chinese society. We also had officials express the need to integrate AI into state-owned assets as rapidly as possible. And they even stated that China needs to completely rethink its education system in the face of broad-based AI deployment. I was surprised by that. Not that they're thinking about it, but that they are willing to express it very directly with foreigners across meetings through the entire week. It was quite remarkable. China's private sector approach to AI has been far more focused on practical application of AI than the large-scale utility models that have attracted so much capital and attention in the US. I think you just heard Ian reference that point. The integration of China's power grids over the last 20 years. When I first moved to China in 2005, Southern Grid and State Grid could not share power. You literally, those two systems were just totally tangential to each other. So they've done a great deal of work about that over the last 20 years. Widespread construction of alternative energy sites and a robust nuclear industry build-out have created the world's leading AI infrastructure for diffusion and absorption of AI technologies. So this has been long in the works. This does not minimize any of the major challenges in the Chinese economy and society. The aforementioned property market collapse and its impact on consumer spending is real. So are the underfunded social safety nets, the lack of any rational property tax regime, the scale of wealth inequality, the gap in rural education, many other examples of an unbalanced economy. Therefore, the challenges facing China, virtually all of its own doing, are substantial and daunting. In comparing the two countries, I often find it interesting to think about it as a game of cards, and each country is holding a hand. The US has a much stronger hand to play than China, but it is very possible to misplay a strong hand. Let's move specifically to healthcare, because that's an area that was covered this morning that I personally am very committed to, both in China and the United States. Over the past 2 decades, I've been heavily involved in China's developing healthcare ecosystem. In 2005, when I arrived in China, only one novel compound was approved that year by the Chinese regulatory authorities. Everything else was on generic pharmaceuticals. All clinical trials were limited to generic drugs. China was spending under 3% of GDP on healthcare at that time. All these things were clearly not sustainable. While many viewed the sector as barren, I saw a country changing at warp speed and increasingly burdened by cancer and huge explosion in lifestyle diseases, a fertile ground for innovative and, more importantly, life-saving solutions. Amid the suffering and inequity, I was invigorated by an entrepreneurial spirit of a new generation of talented scientists eager to make a meaningful difference both in China and beyond. We had seen that before in tech. We had not seen that in the healthcare system as much until that period of time, the 2005-2006 timeframe. 2006, we launched Qiming Venture Partners, which became one of China's largest, and it was the first native venture capital firm dedicated to investing in healthcare and technology. And regarding healthcare specifically, we focused on becoming the leading venture investor to support China's healthcare ecosystem across the full range of technologies and services. The team in Qiming has done a spectacular job, and I'm very proud to be part of that story. I knew if we could inject sufficient capital, modernize regulations, enhance trial integrity, China had the potential not just to create drugs, but to become a biomedical powerhouse. It has achieved that status today, an engine of medical innovation that can positively shape global life expectancy. As an example, Qiming proudly became the lead investor in TigerMed, a small company at the time, the first Chinese clinical research organization to develop world-class diagnostic capabilities at a time when the notion of China conducting globally respected clinical trials felt like a distant dream. Yet TigerMed and its founder, Dr. Ye, made that happen. Thanks to the first-rate research infrastructure they've established, we're now witnessing the scaling of diagnostics and reagents accelerated oncology research, and a surge of Chinese companies capitalizing on a booming licensing market. Just specifically with TigerMed, when we invested in 2008, 95% of their trials were on generic pharmaceuticals. When you looked at 2014, 95% of their trials were on foreign firms trying to bring drugs into China, novel compounds into China. Fundamental transformation. Many highly skilled Chinese came back during this time through the large number of advanced research labs established by the multinational corporations such as Pfizer, Merck, Lilly, and AstraZeneca, to name a few. These sea turtles populated these labs across China and applied their skills, networks, and confidence in laying the groundwork for transforming China's healthcare industry. By 2009, many of these scientists began branching out, much as their brethren in technology did, and started new companies and undertook new commercial projects. They planted the seed corn for a transformation that would yield a 1,000-fold increase in China's biotech and pharma innovation ecosystem. This was catalyzed by visionaries such as Bob Lee, who you heard from this morning, who paved the way for cooperation between the U.S. and China that we're witnessing today. By 2024, China surpassed the U.S. in the number of active clinical trials, a development no one would have seen even 5 years ago. Western pharmaceutical companies have significantly increased their licensing of Chinese pharmaceutical products to the tune of over $100 billion of licenses within the last 3 years. When the phase 3 clinical trial results for ivonescimab, the novel cancer therapy from the Chinese biomedical innovator Akeso, surpassed those of Keytruda, it sent shockwaves through the global oncology community. This was the moment of China's biotech DeepSeek revelation. Not a sudden breakthrough, as DeepSeek was perhaps, but rather a hard-earned achievement built over 2 decades by scientists, entrepreneurs, and visionaries. Looking back to 2005, biotech innovation in China seemed improbable. Laboratories were severely understaffed, talent pool was limited, founders were largely untested, and skepticism loomed over any belief that China could move beyond generic pharmaceuticals. I share this not merely to highlight China's past achievements, they're well documented, but to underscore the fragile yet real transformation that I had the privilege to witness in China. The story extends beyond a single company. It's been replicated across China, spurred by cohort upon cohort of private entrepreneurs and citizens who built world-class industries from scratch, willing them into existence despite uncertain paths to market viability and an initially non-existent talent pool. This highlights a theme woven through nearly all the chapters of the brilliant report that was launched this morning. This dilemma represents a multi-trillion-dollar question for China. The entrepreneurial class that birthed the tech revolution, including in pharmaceuticals, poses a challenge for Beijing, as these innovators might fly beyond the government's control. Xi's reported strategy is not to strangle this golden goose, but laid the golden egg of China's extraordinary rise, but to tether it. In case you don't know, geese don't like to be tethered. This is a serious issue for China. The critical question becomes, can this Beijing leadership effectively balance the delicate relationship between control and dynamism and between security and development? The success of China's technology ecosystems rests on the answer to that question. This report underpins a lot of the thinking that I believe you should take into account when you figure out whether China will be successful in this balancing act. As we stand in the muddy waters of managed competition between the U.S. and China, we also grapple with another crucial question. How do we balance rivalry with responsibility? We recently, this group that I was in China with, co-headed with Stephen Hadley, we began try to structure a different way to think about the upcoming Xi-Trump meeting in April. We came up with a framework that started with, A, realize that there are some global systems that must be maintained for safety and efficiency. The aviation industry presents such an example. B, represent there are legitimate security concerns and interests between the U.S. and China that will lead to de-risking, decoupling, and competition. And we should not try to put everything in that bucket. We should not try to exclude everything from that bucket. And finally, both sides have spent much time talking about blacklists. Perhaps we should talk more about a white list, a list of things that our two governments agree require cooperation and actively encourage that cooperation. I've had quite a few discussions with U.S. policymakers on the Biosecure Act, and while there's a tendency to seek biotech choke points akin to those in semiconductors, the reality is stark. biotech doesn't choke easily. You can throttle AI chips, you can eliminate access to AI chips, but you cannot place tariffs on cancer. You can't tell a patient in Boston or Beijing that their survival hinges on the nationality of the effective pharmaceutical product they need. Public health and biotech is where I believe competition must exist with cooperation. This is a clear whitelist item. Not because it is easy, but because the alternatives are dire. Slower cures, increased suffering, and many lives lost. Every year, 10 million people die from cancer around the world. And the US and China are the top two victims of that. In China, it is the single largest cause of death today. We cannot afford to see healthcare progress as a zero-sum game. Disease doesn't know boundaries and is blind to geopolitical conflicts. Let me be clear, there are areas where cooperation needs to be done in conjunction with competition to get the best possible solutions, and we should embrace that. We should also recognize domains where cooperation may be fraught, but is the only path forward. So I would submit 3 areas for consideration. One we've talked about at some length. That's the cancer collaboration that Dr. Bob Lee mentioned. China offers unparalleled scale and patient volume, while the US brings advanced research techniques and deep capital markets. Together, we don't just improve outcomes, we save time. In cancer research, time equals life. And collaboration can save lives in both China and the United States, and later through dissemination of those technologies throughout the globe. Number 2, mental health. Issues like dementia, depression, addiction don't know borders. In China today, by most estimates, there are between 100 and 130 million people that suffer chronic depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders. The United States, the number is about half that, but twice the prevalence in the society given the larger population that China has. We have an epidemic of mental health issues among its youth. I think the points about Australia banning social media under 16 years old is indicative of that becoming more awareness in the West. China already restricts certain hours per week that the youth can access in its social systems. There are quite a few things we can learn from China if we're a little open-minded about it. China's finally acknowledging this very large population. One of the things that we've now done is the U.S. Olympic-Paralympic Foundation has a program to support mental health for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic athletes, and my wife and I underwrote that program. And we did that 5 years ago, having no comprehension of what the shape it was going to take. Well, in Paris, the International Olympic Committee sent 200 people to listen to Dr. Jessica Bartlett, the head of the U.S. program, talk about what the U.S. has done. We've now had 45 countries visit Colorado Springs, the U.S. Training Center, to look at the U.S. program and figure out how they would do that back in their home countries. I asked them to reach out to China, expecting nothing. The next thing you know, in October, there was a 3-day session, breakfast, lunch, and dinner with the Chinese cohort, and together the two teams are together. The teams are together this week in Hong Kong, talking about this topic. The reason both teams resonate with each other is both countries suffer from the stigma of seeking help. China, even more than the United States. And the whole idea of using Olympic athletes and getting them to tell their stories is to reduce that stigma. So this is, again, something that's making a great deal of progress. And finally, pandemic preparedness. COVID-19 taught us the dangers of fragmented pandemic surveillance. Viruses don't stop at borders. So we must forge a global public health framework or risk repeating these past mistakes. So we've talked about the Cure for Cancer project with CCA that Bob Lee and Jing Chen have been leading, along with the support from Kevin Rudd. And we think that will bridge the gap between US and China scientists, pooling our knowledge and resources in the fight against cancer. In our meetings in Beijing, we brought that initiative up in every single meeting. There was no pushback at all. So our sense is that the Chinese side is very open to listening, particularly on collaboration around those topics. However, to say that cooperation between our nations is fraught right now is to state the obvious. Trust is non-existent, and we're at a time dominated by security logic, where economic and security considerations override humanitarian instincts. Regardless of the situation, my experiences have shown me that dedicated people can build the bridges to point the way so that policy can follow. I've seen China's biopharmaceutical industry evolve from molecule to molecule and founder to founder. And I've enjoyed watching young visionary Chinese scientists create companies out of thin air that today extend life for cancer patients that were only dreams years ago. I've seen US clinicians use Chinese data to validate treatments saving lives right here in the United States. And as we close today, I want to consider if we take a bit of time for the US and China to trust each other again, moving beyond suspicion, which is one of my favorite phrases from Jing. Moving beyond suspicion may not even be possible, but creating predictability in our relations certainly is. One of the big takeaways, again, from our Beijing meetings was that He Lifeng clearly now is the spokesperson for US-China relations from the China side. And it was clear that Secretary Besson is the spokesperson from the US side. That by itself should allow for clearer communication and more specificity in terms of some of the discussions going forward. We can choose to compete alone or more powerfully collaborate for collective healing. If we embrace collaboration over walls and empower our scientists to work where politicians cannot and support the initiatives we've mentioned above, then the next decade of biomedical innovation won't be limited to each country's national capacity. Rather, it'll be remembered as a time when innovation improves survival, diminishes suffering, and saves lives through cooperation. Because the real race we're in isn't against each other, it's against disease. Perhaps then other paths will open for collaboration, such as in AI governance, clean energy transitions, and so many more. So thank you again for your time this morning and for what has been an absolutely fantastic session, and I appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, very much for powerful ideas and with your concrete actions, what you and Yuka did for mental health, for the Olympics, and for cure for cancer, greatly valued and appreciated, and for lifting us beyond suspicion towards creativity and collective solutions and healings. And if we do follow our dignity and to follow human common purpose, we will find our collective healing. And as you said, our greatest competition is not against each other, it's really against our common challenge. Their cancer, their loneliness, their use addictions, their anxieties and despair. And those are not American problems or Chinese problems, they're really human problems. And in the end, do allow me to express my sincere thanks to all the HSID staff members for putting this together, to all the CCA fellows, to all the authors of China 2026. Thank you very much for your help. Many thanks to you all. Many of you are returning from China 2025. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. As you remember, we did predict Alibaba's stock price will go up. You know, it was $70 per share at that time. It is double the price. Hope you bought some. Pay attention to this report. You will find some more insights for investment. But thank you again for walking this middle ground with us and to work with us to expand this middle ground. Hopefully we can keep walking and working together all the way towards 2060 and vote for Hassan. That's all for today's program. Bye for now. Hope to see you again soon. As we said, keep walking. Take care of yourself. See you soon.